on the stone. But that has to be redone every 30 years or so. This will last a bit longer than that. This is proper good carving on new ashlar stone, but it's a very interesting pattern. That's the cliffhanger. Okay. Now, Teresa, I'm going to find your slides.
Thank you. And will there be a way for me to click them on when I'm speaking?
Either that or you tell me and I'll click.
Okay,
Is that
it's a
okay?
little bit complicated, so is it possible it would be best if I click?
And there you go.
And who can
Yes,
use
that's
it?
perfect.
Yes, that would be ideal.
Okay.
We can even move the table slightly further towards you.
Right. Well, can you hear me all right? Yes. Or shall I try and do something with this microphone? Shall I try and put it on? Is that better?
Yes.
That is better. Okay. Well, what I'll do is I'll do this. How's that? Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, for inviting me to your wonderful church here in Iffley. What a magnificent church it is, and what a magnificent year you've had celebrating the 12th century Renaissance, which is just an absolute delight to be part of. So thank you very much for having me here and for coming today. So as Penny's just said, and as you all know, the church we're celebrating, Iffley Church, was largely constructed over the course of the 1160s and the 1170s. And it's enormously interesting to read about. If you don't have one of these, I do recommend buying one. That I've really enjoyed learning about Iffley Church in preparing for this paper. Sorry, I'm just doing a bit of gardening here with the various papers, great. So already in your series, you've had some fantastic talks on St. Friedwide, on art, and as Penny said, on the locality of Oxford in the 12th century. So today we're going to go on a journey from Iffley, from Oxford, to the city of Toledo, which is on the very edges of the Christian world in the 12th century, and then we'll come back again. So here we have a map. You might already recognise it. It's a very famous map. It's the Hereford Mappa Mundi, the largest and the best preserved of its kind. It dates to the end of the 13th century, around 1290, so it's a little late for us here in Iffley, but I've chosen it to start with because it clearly shows where we're going to go. The very centre of the map is Jerusalem. It's a sort of round circle. Ah, you have a clicker. Oh no, it's not working. Not to worry, it's not very important. I should add that this is not orientated like our modern maps, but with the east at the top. So you can see a sort of T, and above the T is Asia. On the bottom right we have Africa, and on the bottom left we have Christendom, or medieval Europe. Here's England, or rather part of England. So you can see London on here, and also, so that's down here, this little sort of sliver on the bottom left. And also you can see Ireland, the even smaller sliver, even further out within the oceans of the world. And here's Oxford. So I've put a little arrow to where Oxford is. You can see just about, that's the River Thames, big London there, and then at the very end Oxford, and that little building is representing presumably the cathedral, or that is Oxford. So if you also look closely, although I think it probably too small for you to see, this bottom corner is the Iberian Peninsula. So I have blown that up as well. And you'll see that it is marked Terminus Europae. That's the red writing on this bottom corner of the peninsula. So this is the end of Europe, or the edge of Europe. And that's because throughout the Middle Ages, the Iberian Peninsula was the point at which Christianity and Islam met. It was the edge of Christian Europe. This had been the case ever since the start of the 8th century, when Muslim armies from North Africa conquered almost all of the peninsula. Here's a more modern map of the peninsula. This shows the situation at the very start of the 12th century, so the year 1100. You see that much of the southern half of the peninsula, Al-Andalus, is under Islamic rule, the rule of the Almoravid Empire in this case. And that in the 12th century, our city of Toledo is very close to this borderline. If you've been to Spain, and especially to the south, to Andalusia, you'll have seen the astonishing legacy of hundreds of years of Muslim rule there. And it is that legacy that we're going to think a bit about today. So keep this funny round building, this represents Toledo, it says Toledo. Keep this round building in mind because we're about to see some buildings that look rather similar. So I said we're going on a journey and we'll have a guide. Let me introduce him. Daniel of Morley. He was a scholar and astronomer. He's been associated with Oxford in the 12th century. Now, I should add, we know very little about him. So there's always the caveat that it's difficult to be certain. We don't have details of where he lived. We don't even know when he was born. He was probably born in the 1140s and died in the early 13th century, perhaps around 1210. So his lifespan, covers the period in which Iffley Church was being built. We know about him because he wrote a treatise entitled Philosophia, or Liber de Naturis Inferiorum et Superiorum, so philosophy, or concerning the natures of lower and higher things. Oh, there's a little picture of Toledo again. And he appears to have written it at some point. Good heavens, I'm sorry. He appears to have written it at some point between 1175 and 1200. The book was dedicated to John of Oxford, the Bishop of Norwich, who is another very shadowy figure about whom we know almost nothing. But in the book's prologue, Daniel tells us that he completed his work using the learning of the Arabs. As a young inquisitive student, he tells us, and I put the quotes up here from the prologue to his Philosophia, he set off for Toledo to access the teachings of the Arabs, which he heard were available there. So he says, I hastened there eagerly to listen to the wisest philosophers of the world. He probably set off at some point in the 1160s, just as Iffley Church was being founded. And he came back at the insistence of his friends, he tells us, which I think is rather nice, probably in the late 1170s, perhaps 1180s, bringing with him to England, as I've put, a precious collection of books. And he told those he met about the wonders and the science of Toledo. So in my talk today, I'd like to encounter medieval Toledo with you through the eyes of Daniel of Morley. We'll encounter it as a city first, a city that would have felt very different to Oxford or very different to any English city in the 12th century. We'll also encounter it as a military front line, which it was for all of the 12th century. And finally, we'll encounter it as a hub of learning, of an exciting intellectual culture that was to have a profound effect on the development of learning in the Latin West, of which curious and adventurous young men like Daniel of Morley formed the vanguard. So, encountering Toledo, this is the beautiful city of Toledo. I'm sure many of you have been there. What would Daniel have encountered on arriving in the city of Toledo sometime in the 1160s? There are a good many first impressions that he might have shared with the modern tourist today. Toledo lies on a hill, on the banks of the river Tagus. The old city is a jumble of narrow medieval streets, crowded with churches, monasteries, houses and bathhouses, all still standing today. The city walls and gates would have been largely unchanged in Daniel's day to how they are now. We can see the magnificent Alcantara Bridge, for example, which is actually a Roman bridge, which makes everything else we're talking about seem positively modern. But the name Alcantara is Arabic for arched bridge. This was a key access point to the medieval city. Likewise, the gates of Puerta de Bisagra, this has been standing since the 10th century. It's a caliphal arch embedded with Visigothic spolia. So before the Arabs, the Visigoths, and these stones were reused in the arch, in the building of this gate. Another less impressive city gate is this one, the Bab al-Mardoum, also from the 10th century. And of course, the river Tagus that weaves its way around the south of the city. The steep banks of the river, crowned with church spires, would have meant that the skyline of the city in the 12th century probably looked rather similar to how it does if you go there today. And of course, Toledo is a city in which the peninsula's Islamic legacy is still very much in evidence. Indeed, Daniel arrived there less than 100 years after the city had been brought under Christian rule. It was conquered in 1085 by the King of Castile and Leon, Alfonso VI. Let's go back to our map. Before that, Toledo had been under Muslim rule, like much of the rest of the peninsula, ever since the early 8th century. So the city had a history of over 350 years of Muslim rule that had lifted not that long before Daniel set foot there. And he would have seen evidence of this as soon as he entered the city gates. Right on the inside of the northern city wall, a short walk away from one of the gates, he would have spotted a church undergoing building work, just like the church at Iffley. Only this church looked rather different. It's the Church of Santa Cruz, now known as the astonishing Mosque Church of Cristo de la Luz. So if you go to Toledo, that's the name you will find it under, but in the 12th century it was known as Santa Cruz. This astonishing building had been a mosque. It was founded in the year 999, 1 year before the millennium, but had come back into Christian hands on the city's conquest. And it was in the 1180s undergoing building work to make it more functional as a church. So an apse was added. I suppose that the time lapse, maybe it was hard getting builders in the 12th century, as it is today. But it's a small building. It has an ingenious array of different arches. So I'm going to show you here the interior, which is the slide from the beginning, the inside of Santa Cruz. It's divided by rows of horseshoe arches, creating 9 little compartments. These were left untouched when the mosque was converted into a church in the 12th century, simply becoming what would be in the place of the nave in a standard Romanesque church. On the outside, you can see the seam where the mosque and the new apse were joined. So this is the mosque, and then we have the new apse starting here on the left, and that seam, in fact, they're not even quite level, perhaps deliberately, I'm not sure. The interlacing arches of various sorts that you see here, horseshoe, semicircular, scalloped, they're all there, weave in and out of the exterior facade. And you can also see the little trefoil arches done in red and white over in this, on this upper part of the facade, which remind us, of course, of the great mosque of Cordoba, that red and white pattern. We see this remarkable intertwining of visual styles and functions, an architectural style that has often been called mudéjar, although it's not an uncontroversial term, throughout Toledo. By the 3rd quarter of the 12th century, so exactly parallel with the early decades of building Iffley Church, semicircular apses were being appended to former mosques all over Toledo. As he wandered south through the narrow streets of the city, peppered with convents and churches, Daniel of Morley would have seen other former mosques, such as San Salvador and San Sebastian, having apses added to them, and their minarets turned simply into bell towers. So here they are. He would also, I should add, have encountered a lot of newly built churches that looked pretty much exactly the same. After the conquest of 1085, many new churches were built in the city, and all in this distinctive Toledan style. So here is another one, the Church of San Bartolome, which is a mid-12th century foundation, so not necessarily reusing a mosque. the narrow city streets would have been full of local masons hurrying to their next job. Daniel may well have witnessed the early stages of the construction of a very magnificent church, the Church of Saint Romain. This was consecrated in 1221 by the Archbishop of the city. Here it is. It's now a museum, and I highly recommend going if you're in Toledo. It's situated at the top of a hill. Its bell tower was the highest point in the medieval city. It's a large and impressive church, built at the orders of a local Christian dignitary. You can see here the late 12th or early 13th century nave building, probably early 13th century. A splendid example of this Toledan style of architecture and of decoration. With its blind arches, its scalloped windows, and the horseshoe arcade in its striking red and white, once again we're reminded of Cordoba, of the magnificent mosques of Al-Andalus. On the inside of the church, we also have a decoration with a cycle of paintings, which you can sort of make out. I couldn't find brilliant pictures of the inside, but if you Google it, you will find other angles. You can see the walls are decorated with the rising of the dead and the apostles appearing in paradise. And they're also ornamented with Arabic as well as with Latin words. So, for example, in the windows, we have this calligraphy, this Arabic calligraphy, that, amongst other things, wishes the congregants al-yum wal al-iqbal, good fortune and prosperity. This brings us to the people Daniel would have encountered in 12th century Toledo. And the thing that he would have noticed first was that for many of them, Arabic continued to be their first language. The use of Arabic was a signal of identity for Toledan Christians, or Mozarabs, as they're often called in scholarship. And for this reason, they continued to speak and write in the language of Arabic for several centuries after the conquest. Indeed, there are over 1,000 Arabic charters detailing the daily business of city life, well into the late 13th century. This is a collection I'm working with at the moment. Many visitors to the city found themselves learning Arabic in Toledo, and it may well be the case that Daniel did too. Certainly, for a young man arriving from England in Toledo in the 1170s, it must have seemed like arriving in another world. He would have been able to go to Mass in all of these churches, I add, and he would have recognised the liturgy in most of them, not all of them, and he would have been able to communicate in Latin or a form of vernacular Spanish, perhaps French, with a proportion of the population, of course, provided he knew any vernacular Spanish or French. But again, not all. He would have met many other young foreign scholars like himself, and we shall talk more about them later. And he might have looked on in interest at the erection of the church buildings all around him on the hills of Toledo, which looked so different from the Romanesque churches he had left behind in England. So, our next section is Encountering the Frontier. What Daniel would immediately have been aware of on arriving in 12th century Toledo was that he was in a city on the front line with the Islamic world. Let's have a look at some maps. I love maps. To remind ourselves of the political situation of the Iberian Peninsula in the 12th century. So, following the conquest of much of the peninsula in the 8th century by a combination of Arabs and North African Berbers, much of what we now know as Spain and Portugal was under Islamic rule. The exact nature of this rule varied. Also, the makeup of the northern Christian kingdoms varied, as you can see. But, where have I got to? Figures like the Cid, you might recognise him as Charleston Heston, made the most of this frontier in the 11th century, and he fought for both Christian kings and Muslim lords. However, from 1085, the year in which King Alfonso VI of Castile and Leon conquered the city, Toledo had been on the frontier with Islamic Al-Andalus. You can see the dotted line. I wanted it to be in colour, but this was the best I could do. That is the frontier. The clarity of this situation was made evident in 1195, when the King of Castile, Alfonso VIII, great-great-grandson of the conqueror Toledo Alfonso VI, was defeated at the Battle of Alarcos by an immense army led by the Almohad Caliph Yaqub al-Mansur, the victorious one. Here it is. It looks like a very inhospitable place for a battle. It was a crushing defeat. Many men, including a number of bishops, were killed, many more taken captive, and Alfonso's armies had to retreat across the river into Toledo. The city remained on high alert for further attack and raids from the Almohads. This situation was actually reversed quite dramatically at the start of the 13th century. By 1250, so by the time that the Church of Iffley with the East End as we see it today was complete, almost the whole of Al-Andalus had fallen into Christian hands, with Cordoba being conquered in 1236 and Seville in 1248, and only the small kingdom of Granada remained in Muslim power. But back in the 1170s and 1180s, war was always on the horizon for the citizens of Toledo. It was both a threat and an opportunity for glory that seeped into daily life. Here, for example, is the front page of a sacramentary, a prayer book, a liturgical book to be used by priests, from the Cathedral of Burgos. And it features a prayer to be said daily in support of the king's armies. So here's the prayer. Look kindly on your servant, our king, and on his army, and accompany them always in protection. Grant that by the virtue of your name, etc., they should powerfully conquer the Muslim people, the gens marorum, who always disparage you, and concede that the barbaric ferocity having been trampled, they may return home with honour and joy. So this is a short prayer, and it would very likely have been inserted into the daily mass, so it's said every day. And it's not unlikely that as a visitor there, who would also have been going to mass, Daniel may well have learned prayers not unlike this one. The 12th century was a time of growing curiosity about Islam. And indeed it was a time when Christian Europe started to take Islam seriously, not just as a military threat, but as an intellectual and spiritual challenge. At the start of the 12th century, the French Benedictine Guibert of Nogent had complained that there was no reliable information about Islam, just salacious stories based on rumours. It was in an attempt to rectify this that the French abbot of Cluny, Peter the Venerable, had the Qur'an, the Islamic scripture, translated into Latin for the first time in 1142. He entitled it the Lex Mahomet Pseudo-Prophetae, the law of the false prophet Muhammad. The text itself was a sort of paraphrase of the Qur'an. It contained numerous hostile interjections by the translator, but it was the first attempt to seriously approach the scripture of the Muslims. Crusaders too might have had some direct exposure to the Islamic East. It's not impossible that Daniel might have known people who had gone off on crusade, perhaps who had joined the Second Crusade in 1147, or maybe the Third Crusade in 1189. However, in Toledo, he would have been able to learn far more, and from first-hand experience. In Iberia, here on the front line, the Muslim other was not a distant or a theoretical enemy at the edges of the sea somewhere else, but an immediate reality. This was not least because, as we've already seen, Toledo was a city shaped by centuries of Muslim rule, the traces of which had become integral to Toledan identity. Moreover, there remained a small but distinct Muslim community in post-conquest Toledo. Muslim merchants, artisans, tailors and doctors can all be found in the chronicles and the notarial records from the city, such as the Saracen doctors who attended to the King Alfonso VII. Another daily reality for Toledans was the presence of captured Muslims from the Andalusi south, prisoners of war, who ended up serving some of the churches I've just mentioned, and who can also be found in households of the Toledan nobility, usually as enslaved captives. Even more interestingly, by the start of the 13th century, we see a growing trend amongst Castilian writers in seeking terminological accuracy when referring to Islam and to Muslims. This is most notable in the translation of the Qur'an, the second translation, which was made in Toledo in the year 1210. The translation was done by a local priest, a canon of the cathedral called Mark of Toledo. for whom Arabic was almost certainly his mother tongue, but he was also an excellent Latinist. As the important study published by Thomas Berman in 2009 has demonstrated, Mark's translation of the Qur'an was very different from the first attempted translation, the Lex Muhammad Suda Prophetae, which I mentioned. Incidentally, it seems that the Lex was not known at all in Iberia. Mark's translation, however, was scrupulously close to the original Arabic. It recreated not only the language and the idioms of the Quranic language, but also the syntax of the Qur'an, even at the expense of the quality of the Latin in some places. It preserved the Quranic structural divisions too, and the shape of the text. It was laid out in chapters just like the surahs of the Qur'an, which is not the case with the earlier attempt. When he was uncertain of the meaning, Mark consulted Muslims themselves and incorporated their responses, their understanding of their text into his translation. And interestingly, he named the finished text simply Liber al-Qur'ani, so the book of the Qur'an, a Latin transliteration of the Arabic title. So that means that the text entered Christian knowledge for the very first time under its original name. Here is one of the only 6 surviving manuscripts of this translation. Other writers in Castile reflected this commitment to accuracy too. Both of the major chroniclers who wrote in Castile in the early 13th century used the term al-Qur'an to refer to Muslim scriptures. They also demonstrate a certain familiarity with Islamic custom. For example, they knew that Muslims fasted for 30 days during Ramadan. They knew that they were summoned to prayers from the minarets of their mosques, and they knew that they swore oaths on the Qur'an. So this is the sort of knowledge you would expect from people who have been living alongside a Muslim society for a very long time. Nor is it surprising that it was a Toledan. In fact, it was the Archbishop of Toledo who wrote the first ever account by a Christian of Muslim rule in the peninsula. His text, which was finished in the 1240s, was entitled the Historia Arabum, or the History of the Arabs, and it drew on a number of Arabic chronicles. It's perhaps ironic that the Archbishop was finishing his History of the Arabs just as the Muslim rule in Al-Andalus was on its very last legs. So I should reiterate that this greater level of knowledge, of accuracy about Islam, does not mean that the Christians in Iberia were any more tolerant or less bellicose towards Muslims. On the contrary, as you saw in the case of the prayer, for them, Andalusi armies were a direct and existential threat, both spiritually and physically. However, Toledo in the late 12th century was a city that had been on the edge of the Islamic world for a very long time. And it was populated with men who were aware they might have to sally out from the city gates and fight at any moment. Islam was a long-established enemy in 12th century Toledo, and because of that, it was a well-known one. And now I'm going to move on to encountering learning. As you all know, Daniel of Morley did not travel to Toledo to join the war effort. He went there for a very different reason. To recap what I said at the start, he went to find, I quote, the teachings of the Arabs, to listen to the wisest philosophers of the world, and to discover the wonders and sciences of Toledo, as he described them. That is, he went there to benefit from the scholarly translations from Arabic into Latin that were and the early decades of the 13th century. Toledo was the principal centre for Arabic-Latin translation in medieval Europe. Scholars had been attracted there to the city perched on the end of Europe, the edge of Europe that we saw at the start, in hope of encountering the new learning in science and philosophy. In his book, The Renaissance of the 12th Century, a book that was published nearly 100 years ago, but I don't think has ever really been displaced, Charles Homer Haskins put it very beautifully, I think, when he says, in the 12th century, the pioneers of new learning turned chiefly to Spain, where one after another sought the key to knowledge in the mathematics and astronomy, astrology and medicine and philosophy, which were there stored up. And throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, Spain remained the land of mystery, of the unknown yet knowable, for inquiring minds beyond the Pyrenees. The great adventure of the European scholar lay in the peninsula, and I think it's clear that Daniel of Morley thought that too. These splendors consisted of the works of the Greek masters of antiquity, preserved through Arabic translations made centuries before, often in Baghdad, but also the subsequent commentaries, additions and other works made by more recent Islamic scholars. Through Toledo, the Christian West received the philosophy and natural science of Aristotle and that of his Muslim commentators, the most important being perhaps Avicenna and Averroes. In medicine, the works of Galen and Hippocrates, and also the great medical treatise of Avicenna, Al-Qunun, the Book of Healing. Budding astronomers sought out Ptolemy, but also the most recent advances in astronomical science from the Arab world, such as the shorter and perhaps more usable elements of astronomy by the Abbasid astronomer Al-Farghani. Likewise, the remarkable astronomical tables by the 11th century Andalusi scholar Al-Zakali, which in translation became the standard astronomic tables used in the West for hundreds of years. Al-Zakali also perfected the astrolabe, and he's one of several medieval Islamic astronomers to have a crater on the moon named after him. In the field of mathematics, these translations introduce the works of Euclid into the West. You have Euclid's geometry up there, but also calculation with Arabic numerals, algebra and trigonometry. These were works that had an indelible impact on learning in the West, an impact evident still in the language of mathematics and science. If you think about the words deriving from Arabic that we use all the time, such as algebra, almanac, zero, alchemy, alcohol, elixir, zenith. Many factors combined to make Toledo the ideal location for this sort of translation endeavour. Its status as a frontier town, though one whose walls were not actually breached in the 12th century, was key. The booty of Christian conquest was not only silks, damasks and people, but also valuable manuscripts, the libraries of former Andalusi kings amongst them. Most Arabs, refugees from the south, and also Muslims who remained in the cities conquered by the Christians were able to act as interpreters to explain these texts. Important too were the Jewish communities across the peninsula. They had taken on much of the Arabic scientific culture and remained largely undisturbed for the first few centuries after the Christian conquests, and were key figures in the translation movement, especially in Toledo. Daniel was not the only Englishman to have travelled to the Iberian Peninsula. His fellow countryman, Robert of Ketton, a priest from Rutland in Lincolnshire, had gone there before him in the 1140s to try to find the treatise on the movement of the stars, known as the Almagest, by Ptolemy, the Greek astronomer. Michael Scott, a scholar from Ireland, made his way to Toledo a little later, at the start of the 13th century, where he would translate Aristotle, also commentaries on Aristotle by the Cordoban philosopher Averroes. Here's a statue to him in Cordoba. And also a cosmological treatise on the movement of the heavens, De Motivus Caelorum, by another Andalusi, the 11th century astronomer Al-Batruji. Incidentally, Al-Batruji also has a lunar crater named after him. Others travelled to Toledo from further across Europe, including my favourite named character of all, Hermann the German, Hermannus Alemanus. However, perhaps the most important for Daniel of Morley, our scholar, was the figure of Gerard of Cremona. Gerard of Cremona was an Italian who, like Daniel, had become disillusioned with the education available to him and had set out to Toledo as a young man. He arrived in Toledo in the 1140s and would remain there until his death in 1187. He can be seen in documents in the Cathedral of Toledo in the 1160s and the 1170s. He had particularly sought out Ptolemy's Almagest, which he did duly translate, but he stayed on and became an absolutely prolific figure. He translated another 86 works from Arabic into Latin. That is a very productive life. These included Euclid's geometry, Aristotle's On the Heaven, and texts on algebra, astronomy and medicine by many Muslim scholars. On arriving in Toledo, Daniel found Gerard of Cremona at the height of his career, and he quickly became one of his students. He tells us that he attended Gerard's lectures on astronomy and cosmology, and I've put it up on the slide. Listening, he says, I was astounded, along with others who were present at his lectures. For the young scholar, this must have been a tremendously exciting time. We don't know precisely how long Daniel remained there, but it may have been 10 or 20 years. It may well be that he learned Arabic during that time, but we don't know. At some point, probably before the late 1180s, however, he returned back home, back to England. And as I said at the beginning, he tells us simply that his friends called him back. I came back to England with a precious collection of books, a precious collection indeed, although we don't know which books he brought back with him. However, we can form some ideas. Daniel tells us that on his return, he encountered his friend, John of Oxford, the Bishop of Norwich. As is customary at the first meeting of friends, he writes, the bishop asked extensively about the wonders and sciences of Toledo. Finally, with much interest in the movements of the celestial bodies, he turned the conversation towards astronomy. And Daniel was so inspired by their conversation that he wrote a treatise on astronomy, dedicated to John of Oxford. Here it is. It's here in Oxford. There is a copy, in fact there's more than one copy, in the Bodleian, just down the road. This was the book I mentioned at the start, Daniel's Philosophia, or Concerning the Natures of Lower and Higher Things, Liber de Naturis Inferiorum et Superiorum. As Daniel tells us in the prologue, it's a book that relays, I quote, the clear and straightforward statements of the Arabs, the Sententiae Arabum, concerning the creation of the world, of mankind, of the elements, the superlunary world, and the nature of the stars. Daniel's Philosophia remains chronically neglected. I'm not aware of an edition of it, though I could well be wrong, of course, but there's very little scholarship on it. So if anyone here is looking for a PhD subject, I warmly recommend that this is a sign that you should move towards Daniel of Morley. Daniel saw his work not only as exciting, but divinely guided. In the prologue to his Philosophia, he provides a fascinating justification of his interest in the work of Muslim scholars. No one should be disturbed that, he writes, when discussing the creation of the world, I cite not the Catholic fathers, but the pagan philosophers as witnesses. For although such men are not numbered amongst the faithful, yet some of their words ought to be pondered, being of good faith with our teachings. Thus we who have been mystically liberated from Egypt are commanded by the Lord to borrow gold and silver vessels from the Egyptians to enrich the Hebrews. Therefore, with the Lord commanding and assisting us, let us borrow wisdom and eloquence from pagan philosophers, and in so doing despoil them in their unbelief, so that we may faithfully enrich ourselves with their riches. So, of course, he's using the language of the Old Testament, the Christians being the chosen people of Israel, and the Egyptians, of course, representing the Muslim world. So we have followed Daniel of Morley all the way to Toledo, and now back potentially to Oxford, where we leave him writing his Philosophia. We have a record of Daniel precisely because he wrote this text. It is in the prologue that he recounted his early life and his decision to leave for Toledo to search out the wisdom of the Arabs. How many other young, disillusioned scholars, perhaps less brilliant or less tenacious than Daniel, also followed this path but did not leave any text to bear witness to their journey? It is certainly through such journeys, such exchanges, such bundles of precious books, that the learning of both the Arab and the Greek masters made its way into the curricula of places like Oxford and Paris, and other centres of learning across the Latin West. One final note. If Daniel had returned to Oxford in the 1170s or early 80s, he would have encountered Iffley Church largely complete. The arches and the beakheads of the magnificent west facade, freshly carved, of course. I couldn't do a talk on this without putting one picture of Iffley Church. And as Penny noted, there seemed to be, at the core bell, on the top of the tower, some little possible double horseshoe arches. I wonder how many passing scholars in the 12th and 13th centuries returning from places like Toledo might have looked at the newly built church and remembered their own academic journeys, the churches being built all over Toledo, the endless arches and the exciting manuscripts. Of course, we shall never know exactly. But here's some further reading, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Teresa, I can only say, what an exciting journey. Absolutely thrilling and so beautifully told.
Oh, thank you.
Full of new news from long ago. Are there any questions?